Paris, 1892. The air carried both perfume and smoke, the promise of glamour and the echo of industry. At night the gas lamps lit up boulevards where artists, aristocrats, and scientists mingled, but in the shadow of these lights stood another kind of theatre, one that did not advertise itself with posters or ticket booths. Within the cold stone walls of a Parisian asylum, something unfolded that blurred the boundary between medical inquiry and grotesque performance. The institution promised treatment, promised the language of science, promised progress in understanding the mind, yet behind locked doors, patients were transformed into unwilling actors. Their convulsions, screams, vacant stares, and trembling bodies were not merely observed by doctors. They were staged, rehearsed, and presented as living exhibits for the curious eyes of an audience eager for shock, knowledge, or amusement. The late 19th century was a time when science itself was a spectacle. Electricity, photography, hypnotism, and neurology were all considered wondrous, bordering on magical. The Paris Exposition Universelle had displayed inventions that dazzled the crowds, but alongside that celebration of human achievement came a fascination with the abnormal, the pathological, and the disturbing. Visitors to the asylum did not come to see paintings or machinery. They came to see humans suffering framed as evidence, as demonstration, as proof that science was advancing. What they witnessed were not charts and data but bodies, living, breathing bodies that carried the weight of illness and the stigma of madness. The asylum in 1892 did not exist in isolation. It was part of a culture where art, medicine, and entertainment constantly fed one another. Writers described madness in poetic tones, painters captured distorted faces, and doctors opened their lecture halls to anyone willing to watch patients collapse, scream, or convulse under suggestion. In a city where theaters were always full, the asylum offered something different: reality. This was not actors pretending to be ill. These were men and women whose lives were consumed by trauma, poverty, neurological disorders, or simply conditions not yet understood. And in the cruel twist of the age, their reality became entertainment. The introduction of public clinical lessons was at first defended as purely educational. Doctors argued that students and professionals needed to see conditions firsthand. But the practice quickly evolved beyond sober teaching. The sessions became orchestrated. Patients were paraded in, symptoms triggered through suggestion or stimuli, their conditions displayed in a way that highlighted drama over dignity. The audience did not sit in silence taking notes. They reacted as if in a theatre. Gasps, murmurs, even laughter sometimes filled the hall. The medical stage became a hybrid, half lecture, half performance. And as the years passed, the line between them vanished entirely. To grasp why this mattered, one must understand the psychological atmosphere of the era. Madness was feared, but also fetishized. The asylum patient became the embodiment of everything society wanted to study but not acknowledge in itself: hysteria, violence, sexuality, weakness, degeneracy. By placing these individuals on display, the city reassured itself that madness could be contained, categorized, and controlled. The asylum became a cabinet of human curiosities, with the added authority of medicine lending legitimacy to what was essentially exploitation. The spectacle gave the illusion of progress, while the subjects, the patients, were stripped of their humanity and reduced to cases, numbers, and living demonstrations. Imagine the atmosphere inside one of those demonstrations. A high-ceilinged lecture hall, packed with students in black coats and collars, journalists scribbling in notebooks, ladies and gentlemen of high society leaning forward with fascination. At the center stood a physician, often revered as a genius, a pioneer. Beside him, a patient trembling, sometimes in chains, sometimes coaxed into a chair. The physician spoke as if conducting an orchestra, narrating symptoms, describing stages of illness, then triggering responses through suggestion, hypnosis, or even physical prodding. The body responded: convulsions, screams, tears, and the audience witnessed what they believed was the pure truth of madness. But truth was not always what was shown. Performances could be exaggerated, manipulated, or rehearsed, and yet the spectacle was accepted as knowledge. The introduction to this story is not simply about medical history. It is about a moral paradox that resonates even today. When does the pursuit of knowledge turn into exploitation? When does observation become voyeurism? The asylum in Paris in 1892 embodied this dilemma in its starkest form. On the surface, doctors claimed to illuminate the mysteries of the mind. In practice, they turned human beings into exhibits. The irony was brutal. Patients admitted in hope of treatment became spectacles, their dignity stripped, their pain consumed as theatre. The City of Light, celebrated for its culture and modernity, concealed behind stone walls a stage darker than any cabaret or circus. This was not simply cruelty hidden away from the public eye. On the contrary, it was performed with prestige. The very institutions that shaped the future of neurology and psychiatry were also the ones orchestrating these macabre shows. Parisian intellectuals, foreign visitors, even future pioneers of psychology sat in those audiences. What they carried away from those sessions shaped literature, art, and medical theory for decades. The asylum stage became a place where science, society, and spectacle collided, and no one who attended could leave without being marked by what they had seen. As we begin this descent into the world of the asylum, we must prepare to confront not only the facts of history but the unsettling questions they raise. The patients who became exhibits in 1892 were not only victims of their illnesses but also of the age's hunger for knowledge at any cost. Their suffering became data, their pain became performance, their humanity became a footnote in scientific progress. And as we step into that shadowed lecture hall, we will see not only what Paris made of madness but also what madness revealed about Paris. This is the theatre of the damned, the asylum where the curtain never rose, because the spectacle was not staged, it was lived. Paris at the end of the 19th century was a paradox wrapped in light and shadow. The city stood as the capital of refinement, progress, and art, but beneath its glittering boulevards lay an obsession with the grotesque, the abnormal, and the macabre. To understand why the asylum of 1892 became not just a hospital but a stage, we must first step into the cultural atmosphere of fin de siècle Paris, a world where beauty and horror coexisted, where curiosity about the human condition turned easily into spectacle, and where science itself was transformed into performance. The Exposition Universelle of 1889 had just dazzled the world with the unveiling of the Eiffel Tower, a structure that symbolized humanity's power to reach higher than ever before. Visitors from across Europe and beyond marveled at engineering marvels, new technologies, and industrial achievements. Electricity illuminated the city, photography captured faces and fleeting expressions, and experimental cinema was about to change how people saw reality. To walk through Paris was to feel as though the future had already arrived. And yet, even in the glow of modernity, the city could not resist its fascination with the strange, the uncanny, and the disturbing. Fin de siècle Paris was steeped in a dual obsession, progress and decadence. On one hand, intellectuals and scientists championed reason, logic, and discovery. On the other, artists, writers, and ordinary citizens were drawn to the morbid, the perverse, and the tragic. Crime tabloids sold in the streets reported murders, suicides, and scandals with sensational flair. Theaters staged plays about madness and horror. Cabarets showcased performers who danced on the line between eroticism and grotesquerie. For the Parisian public, suffering and spectacle were not opposites, they were intertwined. It was within this atmosphere that medicine began to blur into entertainment. Neurology and psychiatry were still young sciences, lacking many of the diagnostic tools we take for granted today. Doctors relied heavily on observation, but observation in this era meant more than private study. It meant display. What better way to prove one's theories than to present them, live, to an audience hungry for novelty? Clinical demonstrations became events, drawing not only students and professionals but also journalists, artists, and even curious members of the aristocracy. Science had an audience, and Paris provided the perfect stage. One cannot overlook the influence of culture on this transformation. Writers such as Émile Zola and Guy de Maupassant explored madness in their works, often depicting characters tormented by unseen forces of the mind. Painters like Odilon Redon and the symbolists filled their canvases with visions of nightmare and delirium. Even the birth of early photography contributed to this fascination, as doctors and artists alike used the camera to capture the contorted faces of patients, freezing suffering into a permanent image. The cultural appetite for the abnormal meant that the asylum did not remain hidden in shame. It became part of the city's fascination with the boundaries of human experience. Paris was also a city of hierarchy and class, and this too shaped the asylum stage. The wealthy could afford leisure, salons, and theaters, while the poor often found themselves in hospitals, prisons, or asylums. To the upper classes, visiting a medical demonstration was not only educational but also thrilling. It allowed them to look upon those deemed degenerate or other, without leaving the safety of their social position. In this way, the asylum became both a scientific laboratory and a social mirror, reflecting the anxieties and desires of a city struggling with its own contradictions. The obsession with hysteria in particular revealed much about this culture. Hysteria, a condition often diagnosed in women, became the central focus of Parisian neurology. It was theatrical in its symptoms: convulsions, paralysis, spasms, and fainting, making it ideal for display. Doctors presented hysterical patients to audiences not only as medical cases but also as living symbols of the mysteries of the human mind. The performances seemed to embody the very spirit of fin de siècle Paris: dramatic, enigmatic, and disturbingly beautiful. At the same time, public fascination with these exhibitions was not purely morbid. Many genuinely believed they were witnessing the frontiers of science. The 19th century had been an age of enormous scientific progress: Pasteur with germ theory, Darwin with evolution, and advances in chemistry, physics, and anatomy. To see doctors apparently unlocking the secrets of the mind felt like standing at the edge of another great revolution. Audiences craved both enlightenment and entertainment, and the asylum promised both. Yet this cultural backdrop must also be understood as one of tension. While Paris celebrated progress, it was also plagued by fear of degeneration, of social decay, of madness spreading through the population. Theories of heredity and racial decline haunted intellectual circles. The asylum provided a way to confront those fears in controlled circumstances. By displaying madness, doctors reassured the public that it could be studied, categorized, and perhaps even conquered. But in doing so, they also transformed patients into exhibits, stripping them of individuality and turning them into symbols of the very fears society projected upon them. This is why the year 1892 matters so much. It was a moment when Paris reached the peak of its cultural contradictions. On the surface, it was a city of light, innovation, and sophistication. Beneath, it was a city enthralled by darkness, eager to stare at the spectacle of humans suffering under the guise of science. The asylum exhibitions did not occur in isolation. They were part of a broader culture where boundaries between art, science, and entertainment dissolved. In a world where everything was a performance, from the opera house to the cabaret, why should medicine be any different? As we move forward into the heart of this story, we must keep this cultural landscape in mind. Paris in 1892 was not merely a setting. It was a character in itself, shaping the practices of its institutions and the attitudes of its citizens. The asylum, far from being an anomaly, was a reflection of the very soul of the city, brilliant and grotesque, rational and theatrical, compassionate and cruel all at once. Without this backdrop, the asylum stage could not have existed. With it, the transformation of patients into exhibits becomes not only understandable but inevitable. The story of the asylum stage cannot be told without tracing its strange and unsettling origins. By the time 1892 arrived, Paris had already cultivated a tradition of turning medicine into theatre, and at the very centre of this phenomenon stood the legendary figure of Jean-Martin Charcot. Known as the Napoleon of the neuroses, Charcot was both a pioneer of modern neurology and an architect of spectacle. His clinical lessons at the Hôpital de la Salpêtrière began as serious medical instruction, but by the late 19th century they had morphed into performances that blurred the line between science and showmanship. To understand how patients became exhibits, one must first understand how Charcot built the stage. The Salpêtrière had once been a grim warehouse of human misery. Originally designed as a hospice for poor women, it evolved into a massive complex that held thousands of inmates: the elderly, the mentally ill, the destitute, and the criminal. Within its walls, women suffering from conditions barely understood by 19th century medicine were lumped together under broad diagnoses like hysteria, epilepsy, and insanity. For decades, the institution functioned less as a hospital than as a containment zone, a place to hide away society's unwanted. But under Charcot's leadership, it was transformed into something far more influential: a laboratory of the mind and a theatre of disease. At first, Charcot's clinical lessons were intended only for medical students and colleagues. He wanted to prove that hysteria and neurological disorders were real, observable conditions rather than mere acts of female imagination. To do this, he began inviting audiences into the lecture hall, where patients would be brought forward to demonstrate their symptoms. The sessions soon took on the structure of a performance: the physician standing at the center, the patient beside him, the audience watching closely. Charcot narrated like a conductor leading an orchestra, describing stages of illness, pointing out physical signs, and sometimes inducing seizures or hysterical fits under suggestion or hypnosis. The effect was electrifying. The lecture hall at the Salpêtrière became one of the most famous venues in Paris. Every Tuesday, the doors opened not only to doctors but also to writers, artists, journalists, and curious members of the public. The hall could barely contain the crowds who flocked to witness what was called the theatre of neurology. Among the audience sat figures who would later shape culture and thought: Sigmund Freud, who studied under Charcot before founding psychoanalysis; André Breton, who would later write about hysteria as a kind of surrealist poetry, and countless others who carried the imagery of these sessions into art and literature. What began as medical instruction had become a cultural event. The structure of these demonstrations reveals how carefully crafted they were. Patients were often chosen for their dramatic symptoms, the ones whose bodies told the clearest stories. They were introduced, posed, and encouraged to reenact their episodes. Photographers captured their contorted postures, and artists sketched their anguished faces. Charcot categorized the stages of hysteria into an almost choreographed sequence: epileptoid phase, clownism, attitudes passionnels, and delirium. Each stage was presented like an act in a play, with the patient performing before the audience. These stages were not merely medical theory, they were visual drama, calculated to astonish and persuade. One cannot overlook the role of imagery in this transformation. The Iconographie photographique de la Salpêtrière, a monumental collection of photographs of patients, became both a scientific resource and a cultural artifact. The haunting images of women frozen in seizures or fainting poses circulated widely, reinforcing the spectacle of hysteria. The photographs gave permanence to the performances, ensuring that patients remained exhibits long after the demonstrations ended. These images, displayed in journals and books, spread across Europe and fed the fascination with the pathological body. By 1892, the practice had grown beyond Charcot himself. Other physicians across Paris adopted the format, eager to replicate his fame. Clinical demonstrations became a standard part of medical education, but their theatricality lingered. The asylum stage was not limited to the Salpêtrière. It spread to other institutions, where patients were likewise displayed as living examples of disease. The combination of performance, photography, and public fascination created a system in which patients were both subjects of study and objects of spectacle. The justifications offered by physicians at the time reveal how the exploitation was cloaked in legitimacy. They insisted that real understanding of mental and neurological illness could only come from observation. They claimed that textbooks and lectures were insufficient. One had to see the phenomena unfold in the flesh. In their minds, the patient's suffering was not wasted if it advanced the cause of science. Yet the frequency, scale, and theatrical tone of the demonstrations suggest that more was at work than pure instruction. Doctors competed for prestige, audiences came for shock and novelty, and the patients remained trapped in the role of performers. What made the asylum stage so potent was the combination of authority and spectacle. Charcot was a respected scientist, and his word carried immense weight. When he declared that hysteria followed a sequence of stages, audiences believed it, even if the evidence was largely drawn from performances shaped by his expectations. Patients, whether consciously or not, learned to deliver the symptoms expected of them. Some historians argue that the demonstrations themselves created the very illnesses they claimed to reveal, a feedback loop in which performance and diagnosis fed each other. In this way, the asylum stage was not only a mirror of madness but also a manufacturer of it. The birth of the asylum stage, then, was not a single moment but a process, a gradual shift from private study to public exhibition, from medicine to performance. By the time the practice reached its height in the early 1890s, it had become ingrained in Parisian culture. To attend a clinical lesson at the Salpêtrière was a rite of passage for young doctors, a fashionable experience for intellectuals, and a disturbing curiosity for tourists. It was science wrapped in theatre, a performance legitimized by the authority of medicine, and a stage on which patients had no choice but to play their parts. As we move deeper into this history, we must remember that the asylum stage did not arise from cruelty alone. It was born of genuine scientific ambition, of a city intoxicated by spectacle, and of a culture eager to see the human body pushed to its extremes. Yet what began as a quest for knowledge became a theatre of suffering, where the line between truth and performance blurred beyond recognition. By 1892, the asylum was no longer merely a hospital. It was a stage, and its patients were the unwilling actors whose bodies told the story Paris demanded to hear. They were called patients, but within the asylum walls of 1892 Paris, they were something else entirely, performers on a stage they had never chosen. To the physicians, they were case studies. To the students, they were living textbooks. To the artists and writers in the crowd, they were strange muses. Yet behind every demonstration lay a human being, often poor, traumatized, and vulnerable. To expand on their stories is to strip away the glamour of medical theatre and confront the reality. These men and women were turned into exhibits, their suffering rehearsed and repeated until it looked like performance. Most of the patients displayed in the lecture halls of the Salpêtrière and other asylums were women. The diagnosis of hysteria dominated 19th-century Parisian psychiatry, and hysteria itself was seen almost exclusively as a female affliction. Women of the lower classes, many of whom had survived abuse, poverty, or abandonment, were admitted with vague symptoms: convulsions, fainting spells, paralysis, hallucinations, or uncontrollable fits. Doctors, searching for patterns, categorized these symptoms and staged them for the audience. But the women themselves, often desperate for attention, protection, or even basic care, became trapped in roles shaped as much by expectation as by illness. Take the case of Augustine, one of Charcot's most famous patients, whose image appeared in countless photographs. She was admitted as a teenager after years of abuse, yet under Charcot's guidance she became the star hysteric of the Salpêtrière. Her seizures, fainting spells, and ecstatic expressions were photographed again and again, eventually forming an archive of hysteria that shaped how the world saw mental illness. But what did Augustine gain from this? Little more than notoriety within the asylum. Her individuality was erased. She was reduced to a set of symptoms, an actress in a performance she could not escape. Patients like Augustine were not only observed, they were trained, consciously or not, to fit the medical script. Doctors expected certain gestures, certain postures, certain cries of pain or delirium. Over time, the women learned what was required of them. Some may have exaggerated their symptoms to gain favor, to avoid punishment, or simply to survive. Others may have been manipulated under hypnosis, a practice frequently used by Charcot and his colleagues. Hypnosis allowed doctors to induce convulsions or hallucinations, effectively commanding patients to perform illness on cue. The result was a cycle. Doctors presented symptoms, patients delivered them, and audiences applauded the apparent clarity of medical science. The performances followed a rhythm that became eerily theatrical. A patient would be introduced by name, often preceded by a description of her history. This woman, aged 22, afflicted with hysteria for 3 years, admitted after repeated convulsions. She would then be placed in the center of the hall, surrounded by rows of expectant faces. A physician might touch her forehead, whisper instructions, or shine a light into her eyes. Almost immediately, the symptoms began: trembling, spasms, cries, or sudden paralysis. The audience watched intently, noting every detail as if witnessing a rehearsed drama. For the patient, the experience was one of exposure, of being stripped of privacy and dignity. Not all patients fit neatly into the role of performer. Some resisted, refusing to display symptoms on command, becoming uncooperative or silent. These patients were often labeled difficult, unhelpful, or even deceitful. Their refusal to perform was interpreted as defiance rather than autonomy. The system left them little choice: either act the part assigned to them, or risk punishment, neglect, and invisibility. In this way, the asylum stage rewarded compliance with the expectations of hysteria and punished deviation. Men, too, were occasionally displayed, though far less frequently. Male patients were usually brought in for epilepsy, deformities, or unusual neurological conditions rather than hysteria. Their cases carried a different tone, less theatrical, more clinical, but they were still transformed into exhibits. Their bodies became examples of degeneration, of heredity gone wrong, of the otherness that medicine sought to define. Yet the fascination remained the same. Audiences came to see abnormality, and the asylum delivered it. What is most chilling about these performances is how easily they blurred the line between reality and theater. Patients were not actors, yet their lives became performances through repetition. They knew they were being watched, studied, and judged. Some may have internalized the roles thrust upon them, shaping their very sense of self around the expectations of the doctors. Others may have felt terror and humiliation, their illnesses laid bare for strangers to consume. Whatever their inner experience, the result was the same: they ceased to be seen as people. They became exhibits, objects of fascination, bodies reduced to symptoms. The impact of this transformation extended beyond the asylum walls. Photographs of these patients circulated in medical journals, books, and even popular culture. Their faces and postures became symbols of hysteria and madness, etched into the collective imagination of the time. Artists drew inspiration from them, writers described them, and physicians cited them as proof of their theories. Yet the individuals themselves were forgotten. Their names, if remembered at all, became mere footnotes to the history of neurology. The photographs outlived their lives, immortalizing them not as people but as cases. To the outside world, It may have seemed that these patients were contributing to science, that their suffering was redeemed by advancing knowledge. But in truth, their dignity was sacrificed to spectacle. They were trapped in a system that saw them not as human beings deserving of care but as specimens to be displayed. The asylum stage gave them no voice, no agency, only a role to play in a performance scripted by others. As we look back at the patients as performers, we are confronted with an unsettling truth. The line between healing and exploitation is thinner than we imagine. These individuals, already vulnerable, became unwilling actors in a theatre designed not for their benefit but for the prestige of doctors and the entertainment of audiences. Their stories remind us that behind every medical demonstration was a human life, a life that deserved compassion rather than applause. And as the lights dimmed in the lecture halls of Paris, the echoes of their cries remained, testimony to the cost of turning suffering into spectacle. They came in droves. The lecture halls of Parisian asylums in the late 19th century were never empty when patients were scheduled to be displayed. To modern ears, it may sound inconceivable that human suffering could draw a crowd, but in 1892, the audience was as important to the performance as the patients themselves. These exhibitions were not private consultations between doctor and subject. They were public events, attended with the same anticipation one might expect at a theatrical premiere. The audience was diverse, curious, and often disturbingly enthusiastic. Understanding who sat in those rooms, and why, reveals just how deeply the asylum had become entwined with Parisian culture and society. First and foremost, the lecture halls were filled with medical students. Paris was the intellectual capital of Europe, and the Salpêtrière was its crown jewel of neurological study. For young men pursuing careers in medicine, attending these demonstrations was considered essential. They believed they were learning to diagnose and classify conditions that no textbook could adequately describe. Watching a woman convulse in real time, hearing her screams, observing the physical manifestations of hysteria or epilepsy, these experiences seemed to offer something more authentic than written words. To them, the patient was not an individual but a living specimen, and the hall was a laboratory disguised as a theatre. But the audience extended far beyond the medical profession. Journalists often filled the benches, eager to report on the latest discoveries or, just as often, to sensationalize the spectacle for the daily press. Their articles blurred science with drama, describing the patients in lurid detail, portraying them as tragic figures or uncanny wonders. The popular press thrived on stories of madness and mystery, and the asylum offered ready-made material. For readers across France and beyond, these accounts transformed the clinical lessons into public entertainment. Even those who never set foot inside the asylum could imagine the performances through the words and sketches that circulated in newspapers and magazines. Artists, too, found their way into the lecture halls. Painters, sculptors, and photographers came seeking inspiration in the raw expressions of human emotion. The contorted faces of patients in seizure, the ecstatic poses of women in hysterical trance, the anguished screams frozen in photographs, all of these fed into the artistic currents of the time. Symbolist and surrealist movements in particular drew heavily on these images, seeing in them a kind of unfiltered access to the subconscious. To these artists, the patients were not just medical curiosities. They were muses whose suffering became a new vocabulary of form and expression. Among the artists who attended was the young Sigmund Freud, who traveled to Paris to study under Charcot. What Freud saw in those lecture halls would haunt him for years and ultimately shape the birth of psychoanalysis. He was captivated not only by the patient's symptoms but also by the strange theatricality of their presentation. Freud later reinterpreted hysteria not as a purely neurological disorder but as a psychological one, rooted in trauma and repression. In this sense, the asylum stage influenced not just art and literature but the very foundations of modern psychology. The presence of high society added another layer of fascination. Wealthy men and women, aristocrats, intellectuals, patrons of the arts, attended the demonstrations as a kind of avant-garde entertainment. For them, the asylum was an exotic destination, a place to glimpse the abnormal safely contained within institutional walls. Watching madness from the comfort of a lecture hall provided a thrill without risk. It was akin to visiting a zoo or a sideshow, except here the spectacle came cloaked in the authority of science. To be seen at one of Charcot's demonstrations was fashionable, proof of one's sophistication and intellectual curiosity. The atmosphere in the hall reflected this mixture of education and entertainment. Students took notes diligently, sketching the stages of hysteria as the doctor described them. Journalists whispered observations to one another, preparing their articles. Artists sat transfixed, their eyes scanning every gesture, every grimace. Members of high society leaned forward with fascination, gasping at sudden convulsions or murmuring at dramatic collapses. The patient stood at the center of this gathering, her body the focal point of dozens, sometimes hundreds, of eyes. Every spasm, every cry, every silence was consumed by the audience as if it were part of a performance scripted for their benefit. What disturbed some observers, even at the time, was the casualness with which the audience reacted. There are accounts of laughter, of applause, even of whispered jokes exchanged during demonstrations. For many, the patient ceased to be a person at all. She was an object of study, a curiosity, a spectacle. The emotional responses of the audience often revealed less about the patient and more about themselves, their hunger for shock, their eagerness to see the extraordinary, their lack of empathy for the suffering on display. And yet, it would be unfair to say that everyone in the audience was purely voyeuristic. Some were genuinely moved, troubled by what they saw. A few journalists raised ethical questions in print, condemning the exploitation of vulnerable individuals. Certain doctors warned that the theatricality undermined medical credibility, reducing science to spectacle. These voices of dissent, though faint, revealed an undercurrent of discomfort even in an age enthralled by the macabre. But such criticisms were overshadowed by the overwhelming popularity of the exhibitions, which continued to draw crowds year after year. The influence of these audiences extended far beyond the walls of the asylum. By carrying their impressions into newspapers, salons, studios, and universities, they spread the imagery of madness throughout Parisian culture. The convulsing patient on stage became an archetype, inspiring plays, novels, paintings, and eventually films. Madness was no longer just a private affliction hidden in institutions. It became a public symbol, woven into the cultural fabric of the city. The audience did not merely witness the spectacle, they amplified it, ensuring its survival in art, science, and popular imagination. Looking back, the presence of these audiences is perhaps the most haunting aspect of the asylum stage. They remind us that exploitation is rarely the act of a single figure of authority. It is sustained by the participation of many, by the students eager to learn, the journalists eager to sell, the artists eager to capture, the elites eager to be entertained. The patients became exhibits not only because doctors placed them there, but because society demanded it. Without the audience, the stage would have been empty. With them, it became a theater of the damned, where suffering was consumed as knowledge and spectacle all at once. Science was the banner under which the asylum stage marched, but beneath that banner lay a tension that has never fully disappeared, the struggle between genuine inquiry and spectacle. By 1892, Paris had become a global center for medical research, with the Salpêtrière at its heart. There was no doubt that real scientific progress was being made. Neurology and psychiatry were maturing into modern disciplines. Yet at the same time, the very methods used to present these discoveries often turned into theater. The line between documentation and display blurred until one could no longer be sure whether the patients were being examined for knowledge or exhibited for entertainment. This section explores that uneasy balance, the breakthroughs and the skepticism, the discoveries and the doubts. Jean-Martin Charcot and his followers did achieve remarkable things. Charcot is often remembered as the father of modern neurology. He carefully documented conditions like multiple sclerosis, amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, later named Charcot's disease, and Parkinson's. His insistence on rigorous observation helped push medicine away from superstition towards systematic study. For many of his students, seeing patients in real time was revolutionary, a way of learning that no textbook could match. His clinical demonstrations showed patterns in symptoms that eventually contributed to more precise diagnoses. These were genuine contributions to science, and their importance cannot be denied. But the method of delivery cast a long shadow. Charcot's demonstrations quickly gained a reputation for drama, particularly when it came to hysteria. The grand hysterical attack, broken into 4 distinct stages, epileptoid phase, clownism, attitudes passionnels, and delirium, was presented like choreography. Patients seemed to move through these phases with almost theatrical timing, convulsing, arching their backs, adopting poses of despair or ecstasy. It was as if their bodies had memorized a script. Critics began to wonder, were these women truly suffering, or were they being coached, consciously or unconsciously, into performing what the doctor expected? The role of hypnosis deepened this suspicion. Charcot used hypnotic suggestion not only as a supposed treatment but also as a way to trigger symptoms on command. A patient might fall into convulsions at the snap of his fingers, or adopt dramatic postures when instructed. For the audience, these displays seemed like proof of neurological mechanisms. Yet skeptics argued that hypnosis created artificial symptoms rather than revealing real ones. Was the patient hysterical, or simply responding to suggestion in a way that pleased the authority figure towering over her? The answer was murky, and the distinction between science and spectacle grew even thinner. Among the skeptics was Hippolyte Bernheim, a physician from Nancy who believed Charcot exaggerated the role of hypnosis and hysteria. Bernheim argued that many of the dramatic symptoms on display were not inherent to illness, but were products of suggestion and expectation. In his view, Charcot's patients were essentially being trained, consciously or unconsciously, to act out roles defined by the doctor. This sparked a public feud between the Paris and Nancy schools of thought, fueling controversy in medical journals and newspapers alike. To some, Charcot was a genius uncovering the mysteries of the mind. To others, he was an impresario, orchestrating a performance that masqueraded as science. The criticism grew sharper as accounts of the lecture spread. Journalists described the theatrical atmosphere, the eager crowds, the women collapsing into ecstatic trances as if on cue. Some observers noted the applause, the laughter, even the murmured admiration of the audience. What should have been sober medical investigation often felt closer to a stage play. The fact that artists and socialites mingled with medical students only heightened the suspicion that entertainment was taking precedence over education. If the goal was purely scientific, why admit so many who had no medical training? The answer seemed clear. The spectacle itself had become the attraction. Yet the tension was not only external. Even within the medical community, there were voices uneasy about the direction things had taken. Some doctors worried that the obsession with hysteria was overshadowing other important research. Others feared that the reliance on performance and photography distorted reality, turning patients into symbols rather than individuals. They questioned whether the data gathered from these staged attacks truly represented the full spectrum of mental illness. The risk was that science, in its eagerness to dazzle, had begun to compromise accuracy. Photography itself was a double-edged sword. On one hand, it offered an unprecedented ability to capture fleeting expressions and bodily postures, creating a permanent record for study. On the other, the very act of staging and photographing symptoms introduced performance into the process. Patients were positioned, lit, and directed like models in a studio. Their suffering became an image, stripped of context, frozen in time, and endlessly reproduced. Was this evidence, or art disguised as science? The ambiguity was never fully resolved. Despite the doubts, the demonstrations continued, and many defended them passionately. For students and young doctors, they were invaluable. To sit in a lecture hall and watch a seizure unfold in real time was an experience no textbook could replicate. To hear Charcot describe the progression of symptoms as they occurred felt like watching science come alive. Even if some symptoms were shaped by expectation, the students believed they were learning something vital. The prestige of the Salpêtrière and the charisma of Charcot ensured that the stage remained a central feature of medical training. The debate over science and spectacle ultimately reveals a deeper truth about the culture of fin de siècle Paris. The city itself thrived on display, whether in theaters, cabarets, exhibitions, or lecture halls. Medicine was not immune to this cultural pull. The asylum stage reflected the values of its time, a hunger for sensation, a fascination with the abnormal, and a willingness to turn even suffering into performance if it meant gaining knowledge or prestige. By 1892, the criticism had not yet dismantled the practice, but the seeds of doubt had been planted. Charcot himself died in 1893, and with his passing the era of theatrical hysteria demonstrations began to wane. Yet the questions lingered. How much of what was observed had been genuine illness, and how much had been performance shaped by the expectations of doctors and audiences alike? How many diagnoses were based on reality, and how many on roles unconsciously rehearsed? These are questions that still haunt the history of psychiatry. The legacy of this uneasy balance between science and spectacle is profound. On one side, the era gave neurology a foundation, establishing methods and categories that remain influential today. On the other, it exposed the dangers of blending knowledge with showmanship, of allowing human beings to become props in the pursuit of prestige. The skepticism that emerged was not merely criticism of Charcot but a reminder of medicine's ethical boundaries all too easily crossed when suffering becomes performance. Behind every performance at the Parisian asylums of 1892 lay a hidden economy, one that transformed human suffering into a form of capital. While the patients were placed at the center of the stage, their convulsions and cries were not their own currency. They belonged to the doctors, the institutions, and the society that consumed them. To understand how these demonstrations flourished, one must look beyond the lecture halls and into the machinery of profit, prestige, and institutional survival. Science may have been the official justification, but reputation and resources were the true fuel of the spectacle. The late 19th century was a time when medicine depended heavily on visibility. Doctors who could publish widely, attract attention, and secure audiences gained both academic prestige and financial backing. Public demonstrations offered precisely that opportunity. A physician who could fill lecture halls with students, artists, and journalists quickly built a reputation as a leader in his field. Each performance added to his renown, and renown translated into influence, appointments, and funding. In this way, the patient's suffering became the raw material from which careers were built. Charcot's rise illustrates this economy perfectly. His Tuesday lectures at the Salpêtrière turned him into a celebrity, not only in medical circles but across Parisian society. His name appeared in newspapers, his photographs circulated in medical journals, and his theories became points of public debate. The Salpêtrière itself benefited immensely from his fame. Once a neglected institution, it now stood at the center of international attention. Foreign doctors traveled to Paris to witness the lessons firsthand, bringing money and prestige with them. The asylum's image was transformed from a warehouse of despair into a stage of scientific progress. Yet at its core, this transformation was financed by the display of patients whose lives remained unchanged, trapped in poverty and illness. The institutional incentives went beyond reputation. Public interest in medicine meant political attention, and political attention often meant funding. Hospitals needed state support, and demonstrating their value to science and society was one way to secure it. By showcasing patients as proof of medical advancement, asylums justified their budgets and even expanded their reach. A hospital that could claim to house groundbreaking research was more likely to attract investment than one seen merely as a charitable shelter. In this sense, patients became living advertisements for the institutions that confined them. There was also a subtler, more personal economy at work, the economy of intellectual property. Doctors were expected to publish their findings, and the most striking cases became material for books, essays, and lectures delivered across Europe. Patients who demonstrated unusual or dramatic symptoms often appeared in medical journals, their images reproduced as visual evidence. Each case study added to the doctor's portfolio, enhancing his credibility and securing his place in the medical hierarchy. For the patient, the result was exposure without benefit. Their likeness could travel the continent, but their lives remained confined to the ward. The press, too, profited from the asylum stage. Reporters knew that stories of madness sold newspapers. Articles describing convulsions, trances, and hypnotic fits satisfied the public appetite for the sensational. Illustrations of patients, whether drawn from life or adapted from medical photographs, added lurid detail to the reports. In this way, the asylum became entangled with the machinery of mass media. Patients were not just exhibits in lecture halls. They became stories consumed by thousands who never set foot inside. The newspapers gained circulation, the journalists gained reputation, and the patients gained nothing but notoriety. One of the darkest aspects of this economic system was the absence of compensation for those who made it possible. Patients received no payment, no recognition, and no improvement in their conditions from these displays. Their role was not voluntary, nor was it rewarded. They were confined, often against their will, and their suffering was transformed into currency for others. The imbalance was stark. The doctors became famous, the institutions became powerful, and the patients remained powerless. To some observers, this dynamic was disturbingly similar to the economy of the freak show. In circuses and traveling exhibitions, individuals with unusual bodies or conditions were displayed for profit. In the asylum, the difference lay in the veneer of science. What was marketed as progress and research was, in many ways, another form of spectacle, one that relied on human lives as its raw material. The only distinction was that the asylum did not share its profits with its performers. The freak show at least acknowledged its subjects as part of the business. The asylum denied even that. There was also a psychological economy at play, the currency of power. For physicians, commanding a hall filled with students and elites reinforced their authority. The ability to summon symptoms with a touch, a word, or a hypnotic gesture positioned them as masters of knowledge and control. The patient's compliance, whether voluntary or coerced, reinforced this image. Each performance became a ritual of dominance, a reminder of who held authority and who was subject to it. The audience, by applauding or gasping, participated in this transaction, validating the physician's role as both scientist and impresario. The cost of this economy was borne entirely by the patients. Their dignity was the first casualty, sacrificed for the sake of spectacle. Their privacy vanished the moment their symptoms were paraded before strangers. Their humanity was eroded by repetition, each demonstration reducing them further to the status of specimen. For some, the psychological toll must have been immense, knowing that their suffering was not seen as personal but as data, a performance to be consumed. For others, compliance may have been a survival strategy, a way to avoid punishment or neglect in an institution where resistance brought only further marginalization. By 1892, this economic system was deeply entrenched. The asylum could no longer function simply as a place of care. It was also a place of production, producing reputations, careers, publications, and prestige. Patients were the raw material, their suffering mined and displayed, but they reaped none of the rewards. This imbalance is what makes the asylum stage so haunting in retrospect. It was not merely a medical curiosity, it was a marketplace built on exploitation, an economy where the coin was human pain. In the end, the dark economics of display remind us that science is never isolated from society. It is shaped by ambition, by reputation, by money and power. The doctors of Paris may have believed they were advancing knowledge, and in many ways they were. But the system in which they worked ensured that the true beneficiaries were never the patients on the stage. Their role was to perform, to provide, to fuel the machinery of spectacle. And when the applause faded and the doctors left the hall, the patients returned to their wards, carrying the weight of an economy in which they had no voice. The story of the asylum stage becomes most haunting when we move from the general to the particular, from the broad descriptions of hysteria and spectacle to the individual cases of patients whose lives became public theatre. Behind every photograph, every lecture, and every demonstration was a human being with a name, a past, and a fate that was swallowed by the machinery of science and spectacle. In 1892 Paris, the Salpêtrière and other asylums were filled with such cases, each one turned into a symbol of pathology. Their stories reveal not only the suffering they endured but also the ways in which institutions transformed that suffering into performance. Perhaps the most famous of all was Augustine, a young girl admitted to the Salpêtrière at just 15 years old. She had fled an abusive home and arrived at the asylum with scars of both body and mind. To the doctors, however, she was not a victim of circumstance but the perfect embodiment of hysteria. Augustine's seizures, convulsions, and dramatic expressions made her the star of Charcot's demonstrations. She was photographed again and again, her body captured in contorted poses, her face frozen in expressions of ecstasy, terror, or despair. These images became iconic, published in medical atlases and circulated across Europe as definitive examples of hysteria. To her audiences, Augustine was not a person but an archetype, a living embodiment of illness. Yet behind the photographs lay a young woman trapped in a cycle of exploitation. Her symptoms, whether genuine or induced, were repeated so often that they became performances. When Augustine eventually attempted to escape the asylum disguised as a boy, it was a desperate bid for freedom from a role that had consumed her life. Another patient whose case became central to the asylum stage was Blanche Whitman, often called La Reine des Hystériques, the Queen of the Hysterics. Blanche was older than Augustine and had been under Charcot's observation for many years. She became the most celebrated patient of the Salpêtrière, a fixture of the demonstrations whose seizures and trance states captivated audiences. Under hypnosis, Blanche could be induced to adopt dramatic postures, reenacting scenes of passion, terror, or religious ecstasy. Charcot used her repeatedly to illustrate the stages of hysteria, turning her body into a living diagram of his theories. Audiences marveled at her transformations, but what Blanche herself felt during these sessions remains a mystery. After Charcot's death, she was largely forgotten, her fame evaporating the moment she was no longer useful to science. She later worked as an assistant to Marie Curie, ironically moving from one form of dangerous exposure to another, her body subjected to radium experiments until it was left crippled and scarred. Blanche's life is a chilling reminder of how exploitation followed her from the asylum stage into the laboratory. Not all patients were hysterics. Some were men displayed for their neurological disorders, their bodies used as living illustrations of disease. One case often cited in medical literature was that of a man suffering from severe ataxia, whose unsteady gait and trembling limbs became the subject of repeated demonstrations. Students were invited to observe his movements, to note the instability of his steps, to analyze the degeneration of his nervous system. For the patient, this meant reliving his humiliation again and again, walking across a stage while strangers scrutinized every faltering step. His illness, already a daily struggle, was transformed into a performance for the benefit of others. Children, too, sometimes appeared as exhibits. In an era with little understanding of developmental disorders, children with epilepsy, intellectual disabilities, or deformities were admitted to asylums and subjected to observation. One documented case describes a young boy whose epileptic seizures were presented to audiences as evidence of hereditary degeneration. His convulsions were triggered, his small body shaking violently under the gaze of doctors and students. The spectacle left a lasting impression on those who watched, but for the boy it meant nothing but exposure and trauma. His childhood was consumed not by care but by the role of a specimen. Illustrations and photographs amplified these case studies far beyond the walls of the asylum. Medical journals reproduced images of Augustine's ecstatic expressions, Blanche's dramatic poses, and countless others whose names have since been lost. These images were studied by doctors, copied by artists, and even shown at social gatherings. In this way, patients became immortalized not as individuals but as types: the hysteric, the epileptic, the degenerate. Their humanity was erased in favor of the roles they played in the medical imagination. The horror of these case studies lies in the way individuality was stripped away. Augustine was no longer Augustine. She was Case 1, Grande History. Blanche was not Blanche. She was the queen of the hysterics. The man with ataxia was not a person but an example of degenerative disease. The boy with epilepsy was not a child but proof of hereditary decline. Each was reduced to a label, a demonstration, a set of symptoms. Their lives outside the asylum, if they had families, if they dreamed of freedom, if they longed for dignity, were erased. What remained was only the performance, endlessly repeated in lecture halls and journals. Some patients did resist. Records exist of women who refused to cooperate, who would not display their symptoms on command. These women were often punished, isolated, or dismissed as malingerers. Their refusal to perform was seen as defiance, not as an assertion of autonomy. Others attempted escape, like Augustine, whose brief taste of freedom outside the asylum ended in her capture and return. The very fact that some risked everything to flee reveals how unbearable their roles had become. The stage was not a privilege but a prison, one from which escape seemed the only hope. The legacy of these case studies is unsettling. Their faces remain in archives, their names etched into footnotes of medical history, yet their humanity is lost to us. They remind us that science can immortalize without remembering, that progress can advance at the expense of those who make it possible. Each patient exhibited in 1892 carried a story far richer than the one presented on stage, but those stories were silenced, replaced by the spectacle of illness. In the end, these case studies of horror reveal the true cost of the asylum stage. The patients were not volunteers, not collaborators in research, but captives forced into roles they could not escape. Their suffering became theatre, their dignity sacrificed for knowledge and prestige. The haunting truth is that they did not vanish when the demonstrations ended. They linger in the photographs, in the journals, in the uneasy legacy of a science that could not separate discovery from display. And in their silence, they remind us that every exhibit was once a person, every case study a life. The theatre of the asylum could not last forever. By 1892, cracks were already beginning to show in the spectacle that had once enthralled Paris. Though the performances of hysteria and neurological illness had captured the imagination of doctors, artists, and society alike, voices of resistance were emerging. Doubt spread not only within the public but also among members of the medical community itself. The asylum stage, once seen as a symbol of progress, began to look increasingly like an embarrassment, a distortion of science into entertainment. The decline of this practice was neither sudden nor simple, but it was inevitable, as criticism and ethical unease mounted against a backdrop of shifting cultural values. The first challenge came from within medicine itself. Rival schools of thought had always existed, but by the late 1880s and early 1890s, opposition to Charcot's methods grew louder. The Nancy School, led by Hippolyte Bernheim and Ambroise Auguste Liebau, openly criticized the use of hypnosis and questioned whether the dramatic hysterical fits displayed at the Salpêtrière were genuine phenomena or products of suggestion. They argued that Charcot's patients were essentially performing roles shaped by the expectations of their doctors. What Charcot presented as objective science, they claimed, was closer to a theatrical illusion. This challenge undermined the credibility of the demonstrations and cast doubt on the very foundation of the asylum stage. Journalists, too, began to turn against the spectacle. While many had once written about the demonstrations with fascination, some began to express unease at the exploitation of patients. Articles questioned the ethics of exposing vulnerable individuals to large audiences, describing the practice as cruel and sensational. Critics accused doctors of using their patients as props to advance careers rather than as individuals deserving care. The press, which had once amplified the spectacle, now played a role in eroding its legitimacy. Public opinion, slowly but surely, began to shift. Humanitarian voices added to the growing resistance. The late 19th century saw the rise of social reform movements in France, advocating for improved conditions in hospitals, prisons, and asylums. Reformers argued that the mentally ill deserved compassion and dignity rather than exposure and ridicule. They emphasized treatment over display, care over exploitation. While these reformers did not immediately dismantle the asylum stage, they created a moral climate in which its continuation became harder to defend. To a society increasingly aware of human rights, the public exhibition of suffering began to look less like progress and more like cruelty. Within the halls of the Salpêtrière itself, the decline was accelerated by the death of Charcot in 1893. Without his authority and charisma, the Tuesday lectures lost much of their luster. His successors lacked the theatrical presence that had made the demonstrations so compelling. While clinical instruction continued, the grand performances faded. The medical establishment, eager to distance itself from accusations of spectacle, shifted toward quieter, more private methods of study. The age of the hysterical stage star was over, replaced by a more restrained form of medical observation. At the same time, psychiatry as a field was evolving. The fascination with hysteria gave way to other concerns: degeneration theory, heredity, and the emerging science of psychology. Sigmund Freud, once a student at the Salpêtrière, took Charcot's lessons in a different direction, focusing on the unconscious mind rather than theatrical displays of symptoms. As psychoanalysis began to gain traction, the need for public demonstrations waned. The stage was replaced by the couch, the performance by introspection. What had once been a public spectacle was transformed into a private dialogue between patient and analyst. Resistance also grew from the patients themselves. Though many were powerless, some attempted to resist their roles as exhibits. Records exist of patients refusing to perform, refusing to enter trance states, or attempting escape. Their defiance disrupted the smooth operation of the stage, reminding audiences that these were not actors but individuals with wills of their own. While such acts of resistance were often punished, they revealed the cracks in the system. The theater could only function as long as patients complied. Their refusal signaled the beginning of its end. The decline of the asylum stage also reflected broader cultural changes. Paris at the fin de siècle was shifting from one era to another, moving toward the anxieties of the 20th century. The fascination with hysteria and spectacle seemed increasingly outdated in a society grappling with new fears: industrialization, social unrest, and political upheaval. The spectacle of madness no longer fit the modern image of science that the new century demanded. Medicine sought to present itself as rigorous, objective, and ethical, distancing itself from anything that looked like theater. Yet the decline was not a clean break. Echoes of the asylum stage lingered for decades. Photographs of hysterical patients continued to circulate in textbooks, shaping medical and cultural understandings of mental illness. Artists continued to draw inspiration from the imagery of convulsions and trances. And in popular culture, the fascination with madness persisted, migrating from lecture halls to theaters, novels, and eventually cinema. The asylum stage may have closed, but the spectacle of suffering had found new arenas in which to play out. Looking back, the resistance to the asylum stage reveals a paradox. On one hand, it marked progress, a growing recognition of patients' dignity and a rejection of exploitation masquerading as science. On the other, it exposed how deeply spectacle had shaped the development of medicine. Even as the performances faded, the knowledge they produced, and the images they left behind, continued to influence psychiatry, neurology, and culture at large. The patient's suffering had been consumed, and even resistance could not erase its traces. By 1892, the decline was already underway. Within a few years, the great theatre of the Salpêtrière would be no more. But its memory lingered, haunting the conscience of medicine and raising questions that remain unresolved. How do we balance observation with compassion, knowledge with dignity, discovery with ethics? The resistance to the asylum stage was not just about ending a spectacle, it was about redefining the very purpose of medicine. And while the curtains eventually fell, The uneasy lessons of that theater would continue to echo long into the future. When the curtain finally began to fall on the asylum stage, its influence did not vanish. Instead, it spread outward, leaving a long legacy that shaped medicine, art, and culture far beyond the lecture halls of Paris. What happened inside the Salpêtrière in 1892 was not an isolated chapter of medical history. It was a formative moment that helped define how the world came to understand madness, the human body, and the ethics of science. The legacy of those performances is unsettling precisely because it is so deeply woven into the fabric of disciplines and cultural forms we take for granted today. In medicine, the impact was immediate and enduring. Charcot's lectures, however theatrical, left behind a body of knowledge that influenced generations of doctors. His classifications of neurological conditions laid the groundwork for modern neurology, and his insistence on direct observation shaped medical pedagogy well into the 20th century. Students who sat in his audience carried his methods back to their own countries, spreading the influence of the asylum stage across Europe and beyond. Even Freud, who later departed from Charcot's theories, credited his Parisian training with opening his mind to the psychological dimensions of hysteria. Without those theatrical lessons, psychoanalysis itself might never have taken root. At the same time, the ethical questions raised by the demonstrations began to reshape medicine's self-image. The criticisms leveled at the asylum stage forced the medical community to confront the dangers of spectacle. Over time, psychiatry moved toward private consultations, more confidential observations, and greater emphasis on patient dignity. The very practices we now consider essential to medical ethics, privacy, informed consent, respect for the individual, emerged partly in response to the abuses of the 19th century. The asylum stage, in this sense, became a cautionary tale, a reminder of how easily science can cross the line into exploitation. The cultural legacy was equally profound. The images of hysterical patients captured in photographs and illustrations lived on, inspiring artists across movements. Symbolist painters drew on their contorted postures, while surrealists celebrated hysteria as a form of unconscious poetry. Writers such as André Breton and Antonin Artaud treated the convulsions and ecstasies of asylum patients as a kind of raw performance art, a window into the irrational depths of the human psyche. What began as medical documentation became cultural mythology, feeding into avant-garde art, literature, and eventually cinema. The very aesthetic of hysteria, arched backs, twisted limbs, ecstatic expressions, can be traced directly from the Salpêtrière to the stages and screens of the 20th century. The asylum stage also influenced how society thought about gender. Because hysteria was primarily diagnosed in women, the performances reinforced cultural stereotypes of female fragility, emotional instability, and susceptibility to suggestion. These ideas lingered long after the demonstrations ended, shaping both medical practice and broader social attitudes toward women. Even today, echoes of those stereotypes remain in the language of hysterical behavior or the dismissal of women's medical complaints as exaggerations. The legacy of the asylum is thus inscribed not only in medical textbooks, but in cultural prejudices that have proven remarkably resistant to change. In popular entertainment, the spectacle of suffering migrated into new forms. The freak show and the circus, already popular in the 19th century, found new legitimacy by echoing the language of science. Exhibits of unusual bodies were often presented as educational as well as entertaining, blurring the line in much the same way as the asylum stage had done. Early cinema, too, drew inspiration from medical photography and the performances of hysteria. Silent films frequently featured exaggerated convulsions, trance states, and ecstatic expressions, tropes directly descended from the images of patients once paraded in Parisian lecture halls. The spectacle lived on, only its stage had changed. Perhaps the most disturbing aspect of this legacy lies in the persistence of voyeurism disguised as knowledge. Even as medical ethics evolved, society continued to consume suffering as spectacle. The impulse that once drew Parisians to the Salpêtrière did not disappear. It found new outlets. The asylum stage planted the seed for a culture fascinated by pathology, by the boundaries of the human body and mind. Medical museums displayed skulls, organs, and skeletons. Newspapers sensationalized crime and madness. In the 20th century, documentaries and television programs brought patients back into public view under the guise of education. The performances of 1892 echoed through every medium that presented illness, madness, or abnormality for public consumption. Yet there is also a more hopeful dimension to the legacy. The outcry against the asylum stage played a role in the birth of medical ethics and human rights discourse. Reformers who condemned the exploitation of patients helped lay the groundwork for the principle that medicine must serve the individual, not the institution. Over time, this ethos expanded into movements for mental health reform, deinstitutionalization, and patient advocacy. While the spectacle caused immense harm, its exposure also forced medicine to reckon with its darker impulses. The memory of the asylum stage became a warning, shaping a future in which dignity and care would be emphasized, at least in principle. Still, the haunting images remain. When we look at the photographs of Augustine or Blanche, we cannot help but feel both fascination and discomfort. They are reminders of the human cost of spectacle, but also of the strange power it wields. Those images continue to appear in art exhibitions, academic texts, and even fashion photography, repurposed and reinterpreted but never forgotten. The legacy of the asylum is thus double-edged. It enriched science and culture while leaving behind an ethical scar that has never fully healed. In tracing this legacy, we see how deeply the asylum stage influenced not just the history of medicine but the very way modern culture imagines madness and suffering. It created archetypes, inspired art, provoked reform, and exposed the risks of blending science with theatre. Its echoes can be heard in hospitals and museums, on stages and screens, in the language we use and the images we consume. Though the lecture halls of 1892 have long since fallen silent, their resonance endures, shaping the way we see both science and humanity itself. The theatre of the asylum may have closed its doors, but its spirit has never truly disappeared. The spectacle of human suffering, once confined to lecture halls in Paris, has found new stages in the modern world. Today, the technologies have changed, the language has shifted, and the justification has evolved, yet the pattern remains disturbingly familiar. Society still consumes suffering as entertainment, often cloaked in the guise of education, awareness, or even compassion. By looking at modern parallels, we can see how the legacy of the 1892 asylum persists, reminding us that the appetite for spectacle has not diminished, it has only adapted. One of the most obvious parallels lies in the rise of reality television. Shows that claim to document everyday life often thrive on conflict, humiliation, or breakdowns. Contestants cry, rage, or collapse under pressure, their vulnerabilities broadcast to millions. The audience watches with fascination, sometimes with empathy, often with judgment. Though these participants enter willingly, unlike the asylum patients of the 19th century, the mechanics are similar. Suffering becomes content, and human emotion is transformed into entertainment. The screen replaces the lecture hall, but the gaze of the audience remains just as hungry. The internet has expanded this phenomenon exponentially. Platforms like YouTube, TikTok, and Instagram host countless videos of people sharing medical conditions, psychological struggles, or personal crises. Many creators use these platforms to educate and destigmatize, but the line between awareness and spectacle can blur quickly. Viral clips of fainting, seizures, or breakdowns often circulate without context, consumed as shocking content rather than opportunities for understanding. The audience, just like in 1892, gasps, comments, and shares, transforming someone's pain into a moment of fleeting entertainment. The patients of the asylum stage are mirrored in the influencers, streamers, and ordinary people whose suffering is broadcast for public consumption. Medical reality shows offer perhaps the most direct echo of the asylum performances. Programs that follow doctors, surgeons, or psychiatrists often highlight dramatic cases, framing them as both educational and entertaining. Viewers watch surgeries, diagnoses, and treatments with the same mixture of awe and curiosity that once filled the halls of the Salpêtrière. While these shows often emphasize their educational value, the dramatic editing, suspenseful music, and focus on unusual conditions reveal their dual function. They are as much spectacle as science. Just as Charcot's demonstrations blurred medicine with theatre, modern medical television blurs education with entertainment. The digital age has also created a new form of voyeurism, the viral medical video. Clips of unusual conditions, strange behaviors, or dramatic treatments spread rapidly online, often detached from their original context. A person with a rare disorder may find themselves transformed into a meme, their likeness shared across platforms without consent. The public fascination with pathology has not diminished since the 19th century. It has intensified, amplified by the reach of the internet. Patients are once again turned into exhibits, their humanity obscured by the curiosity they provoke. There is also the world of true crime media, which thrives on the detailed exploration of murder, madness, and pathology. Podcasts, documentaries, and streaming series dissect the minds of killers, the suffering of victims, and the failures of institutions. Audiences binge these stories with the same mixture of horror and fascination that once drew crowds to the asylum. True crime is marketed as investigation, but it is also entertainment, consumed for thrills as much as for knowledge. In this sense, the macabre curiosity that once filled lecture halls has migrated into living rooms and earbuds. The persistence of spectacle raises troubling ethical questions. Are we truly more advanced than the Parisians of 1892, or have we merely changed the form of our voyeurism? We may no longer gather in lecture halls to watch hysterical patients convulse, but we scroll through endless feeds of videos showing people in distress. We may no longer applaud the doctor commanding symptoms through hypnosis, but we cheer for reality TV judges who provoke tears. We may no longer immortalize patients in medical atlases, but we share their images in memes and reaction videos. The hunger for spectacle remains the same, only the medium has changed. What makes these modern parallels even more haunting is the illusion of consent. Today, many individuals choose to share their stories online, seeking community, awareness, or even fame. But choice is complicated in an environment driven by algorithms, monetization, and audience demand. Just as patients at the Salpêtrière may have felt compelled to perform symptoms to receive care or attention, modern creators may feel pressured to share increasingly dramatic or intimate content to maintain visibility. The performance of suffering becomes a survival strategy in a digital economy that rewards spectacle. The parallels extend even further into how we understand mental health. Social media platforms are filled with discussions of anxiety, depression, trauma, and neurodivergence. While these conversations can foster awareness and empathy, they also risk reducing complex human experiences into consumable fragments. A 30-second clip of someone describing a panic attack may go viral, but the individual's broader humanity is lost. In this way, modern audiences consume mental illness much like the audiences of 1892 consumed hysteria, as a fascinating glimpse into the abnormal, stripped of context and nuance. And yet, just as in the 19th century, there are voices of resistance. Critics challenge the exploitation of suffering in media, calling for greater privacy, dignity, and ethical responsibility. Activists push back against the commodification of illness and trauma, demanding that individuals be seen as people, not content. These voices echo the reformers who once condemned the asylum stage, reminding us that progress is always contested. The question is whether society will listen, or whether the lure of spectacle will continue to outweigh compassion. Ultimately, the modern parallels remind us that the asylum stage never truly ended, it merely changed form. The hunger to witness suffering, to turn pain into performance, continues to shape our culture. Whether through television, social media, or podcasts, the legacy of 1892 Paris endures, haunting our screens as surely as it once haunted the lecture halls of the Salpêtrière. The difference is only in scale. Where hundreds once watched a patient convulse in Paris, millions now watch online. The spectacle has expanded, but the ethical questions remain the same. Paris, 1892. The lights of the city glowed with the promise of progress, casting long shadows across boulevards where carriages rattled and artists sketched beneath the gas lamps. But behind the heavy doors of the asylum, another kind of theatre unfolded, one that history has not forgotten, though it wishes it could. The patients inside were not healed. They were displayed, transformed into exhibits for audiences hungry for knowledge, spectacle, or both. As the curtain slowly fell on this dark stage, it left behind more than just medical theories. It left behind questions about science, about humanity, about the cost of curiosity. The conclusion of this story begins with silence. When the applause faded, when the doctors left the lecture halls, the patients remained behind, returned to their wards, to their suffering, to the reality that their lives were not performances but daily struggles. For them, there was no closure, no recognition of what had been taken. Their dignity was consumed, their humanity reduced to symptoms in notebooks and images in journals. In their silence, we hear the echo of an uncomfortable truth. Knowledge was built on their pain, and the world applauded. As we step back from the details of 1892, the broader lesson becomes clear. The asylum stage was not an aberration. It was a mirror of its society, a society that valued spectacle as much as progress, that believed the suffering of the few could be justified if it served the curiosity of the many. In this way, the asylum was less a hospital and more a theatre of morality, a place where science collided with cruelty and left audiences unsure of which prevailed. The fall of the asylum stage did not erase its impact. The photographs of hysterical women, the case studies of epileptics and the insane, the the descriptions of seizures and trances, they all remained, haunting the pages of medical history. Artists continued to borrow from those images, writers continued to imagine madness through their lens, and medicine continued to wrestle with the ethical boundaries the spectacle had crossed. The curtain fell, but the ghosts of the performances lingered, shaping culture long after the lectures ended. We must also acknowledge the irony. The patients who were displayed as exhibits are the ones who remain most visible today. Their names, Augustine, Blanche, and others, are remembered not as individuals but as archetypes of illness. Their photographs survive in archives, circulated endlessly in books and galleries. They outlived their doctors in memory, but not in personhood. They became immortal, but only as symbols of suffering. The very exploitation that stripped them of dignity ensured that they would never be forgotten, though never remembered as whole people either. The uneasy lesson of this history is that science does not exist in a vacuum. It is shaped by ambition, by culture, by the hunger for spectacle. In 1892, Paris believed it was watching progress unfold. And in some ways, it was, neurology advanced, psychiatry matured, psychology was born. But progress was paid for in human currency. The patients' bodies were the theatre, their minds the script, their pain the performance. The applause was not for them, but for those who orchestrated their suffering. When we reflect on this history, we cannot help but ask, how different are we today? The asylum stage has vanished, yet modern society continues to turn suffering into entertainment. Reality television, viral videos, and sensational documentaries all trade in the spectacle of pain. Consent may be more visible, but the hunger of the audience remains the same. Have we truly advanced beyond the cruelty of 1892, or have we merely changed the stage and the costumes? The haunting answer may be that the impulse is timeless, and that vigilance is required to prevent exploitation from repeating itself under new guises. The conclusion of this story is not a neat ending but an invitation to remember. Remember the patients whose voices were silenced. Remember the applause that masked their cries. Remember the lesson that science without ethics becomes theatre, and theatre without compassion becomes cruelty. The asylum stage reminds us that progress can blind as easily as it can illuminate, that curiosity can consume as easily as it can enlighten. So, as the curtain falls for the last time, we return to Paris, 1892. The gas lamps flicker, the lecture halls empty, the city carries on. But in the quiet wards of the asylum, the true story remains, unseen, unheard, except in the echoes that reach us across more than a century. This is not just the history of an institution. It is a warning that whenever we look upon suffering, we must ask ourselves whether we see a person or an exhibit. For once we forget the difference, we step once again into the theatre of the damned.